So now, going to the second session. It's a session based on a book called Beached Driftwood by Professor Ajanta Paul. The thing is, we have a famous fashion designer called Coco Chanel, the founder of the Chanel brand. And it is her words that a girl should be two things. A girl should be two things, classy and fabulous. A girl should be two things, classy and fabulous. So in this book, Beach Driftwood, we would like to hear about, we would like to explore and examine the world of the poet, of the author, Professor Ajanta Paul, from domesticity, from ordinary domesticity to academics. May I request our moderator for the session, Somudranil Sarkar, to be on stage, and then he will lead the session. Somudranil, please. I now request Professor Ajanta Paul, and with her we have Professor Sudeshna Chakravorty. Sudeshna, please. Somudra, this is your session, so you take the lead from here.
Right. So the topic for this session is a girl should be two things, classy and fabulous, as Coco Chanel rightly said, and from domesticity to academics, Ajanta ma'am would be discussing her book of poems. That's very enticing. I'll just start off with a question, and then you both can take it forward. That's fine. Right. So ma'am, my question is to you. Can poetry effectively challenge traditional gender roles associated with domesticity, or say, does it reinforce them?
Well, Somudranil, first let me thank the organizers, Kiriti and Bitan, for giving me this wonderful opportunity to share a few thoughts with all of you. Now, coming to your specific question, does poetry affect gender roles? Well, traditionally, it was more of a classist thing, with the elite classes engaging in the pursuit of poetry, right? And the subaltern classes were, because by virtue of a lack of a privileged education, they were not able to pursue it. But if we come to gender, I would again say that it was, like many things, the bastion of the male, right? But in this day and age, I think those distinctions have blurred. And the modern woman, having come into her own, is well equipped to take on the challenges posed by poetry, because gender obviously is important, because on various socioeconomic indices, the woman is not on par with the man, and therefore she may suffer. So indirectly she has to face certain challenges which may affect her poetic output. But intellectually, I would say that, or artistically or creatively, she is at par with men. And so I think, though it is more of a challenge for her to prove herself, in traditional patriarchal societies, nevertheless, I would suggest that, well, the modern woman is more or less equipped to express herself poetically, to yield a certain poetic oeuvre which can match that of her male counterparts. Thank you.
So, thank you, Somudranil. Okay, good morning, everyone. Actually, it is a tough thing, a tough act to follow, because the session that you heard just before had two of my teachers. And when you hear them speak early in the morning, it is a learning experience, a kind of nostalgic experience. I found myself back in my college classroom and my university classroom. So to come back to conduct business here is a bit difficult for me, but I think they have trained me well, at least I hope so. So let me see how much sense I can speak. The line that Kiritida just quoted of Coco Chanel, that a girl should be two things, classy and fabulous. One of the issues that can be brought up with the word classy, since we are poets, we deal with words, with the different connotations of words. So classy does have some problematic connotations with it as well. Automatically, the idea of class, a kind of privilege, becomes associated with it. And anyone who knows Coco Chanel knows that yes, you indeed have to be classy to be to afford her. But if classy means privilege, now one thing that we cannot deny, that all of us who are sitting here are indeed privileged to some extent. If we did not have the privilege of education, if we did not have that access, we would not have been here. But how we utilize what has been given to us, we cannot always deny whatever good fortune has been given to us. How responsibly, how sensitively we use whatever privilege has been given to us is, I think, the determining factor which makes us fabulous or not. And the journey of academicians, the journey of poets, I think is that sensitive journey. It is that journey of self-discovery, of looking at our relationships with ourselves in relation to the people who have shaped us, the institutions which have shaped us. It is a look into a questioning of the social, political, economic realities around us, and of our association with words, with the creative process, all of which is addressed, dealt with very deftly and very sensitively in Ajanta Di's book, Beached Driftwood. The first thing that all of us will probably get attached to, which I definitely got attached to, was the title. Beached Driftwood has such a evocative ring to it, and I felt that it is talking about all of us, those who enter into the creative journey, those who are just living life in a way, because we are all pieces of driftwood. We are all moving around in that river of life. Yeah, cliched as the image might be, but yes, that is what we do. And at times we come up to the beach, we take a temporary shelter there, and we leave bits and pieces of ourselves for other sensitive souls to collect, like seashells, like the pieces of driftwood which children collect, which maybe even we collect. But I would like to ask Ajanta Di here, what exactly made you come to this particular title? What were your thoughts when you chose this for your collection?
Well, Sudeshna, as you have mentioned, it's a rather evocative term, and pieces of driftwood, large or small, which are carried by the waves and then they are brought and deposited on the shore, have a particular salience for me. Because I feel that a poem is like a piece of driftwood, which voyages across the oceans of the poet's mind, across the tumultuous seas of thought and imagination, and is deposited on the shore of the consciousness of the poet. So this littoral imagery, the image of the driftwood or the image of the seashell, if you pick up a seashell and hold it to your ear, it resonates with music. The music of the ocean, the music of eternity. So I believe these literal images are kind of equivalents of poetry. So I've always been fascinated by these literal images because of the stories that have been inscribed on them. A piece of driftwood may be oddly twisted. If you pick it up, you'll find that it has a very odd shape. So it has been twisted and beaten into that shape by the waves. So the elements have been acting on it, the sun, the sea, the waves, the water, the salt water, and these things have made it what it is today. And so I feel that each piece of driftwood has a story to tell. It has a narrative inscribed, in its being. So I just try to decipher those lines, those thoughts, those stories which have been inscribed on pieces of driftwood.
Thank you, Ajanta Di. We are very postmodernist and post-structuralist, and we have all those theories under our belt of the death of the author and all of that. But the temptation of hearing it from the horse's mouth, the thoughts that went on in the mind of the creator when they were thinking of something, the particular word that they used and all, that gives a completely different perspective to our reading. So, of course, that helps, and then we have our own experiences, we come to each work of art with our own standpoints. But when I was reading through the poems, beautiful poems, all of them, the first thing that, of course, struck me was this starting of the creative journey. In Marooned, Ajanta Di says that in a desert island of mundane metaphors and briars of barren themes, I strive to be rescued. Yes, I cry out, trying first one and then another voice. A creative artist, whether a poet, a painter, we were hearing a lot about that in the first session. It is about finding one's own style and voice. It might not be that the painter is thinking, as Shormila Di so rightly pointed out, that I have to be a cubist or an impressionist or a poet, unless someone is consciously experimenting, like our very, very experimental poet, Rajarshida, who sets out to challenge himself with new forms, that apart. But in general, we might not think in those terms, but every creative artist goes through that search of which voice, which style works best for me, whether I want to write poetry, whether I want to paint or whatever. So trying first one voice and then another voice. So Ajanta Di has had a long journey wearing different hats, the domestic roles, the roles of the academician, the administrative hats of principal. So that has been a long journey. In fact, in an like in a informal conversation with Ajanta, I had said that you are Ulysses and Telemachus rolled into one. So you have the Ulysses is a wish to strive and seek and that creative journey, and hard-bound to duty as well, like Telemachus. So that is something that now I want to hear from Ajanta, your journey, your domestic roles, the challenges, and then your foray into academics, all of that. And then finally, how does creativity factor in all of this? How do you find time for it? What is that journey like?
Okay, Sudeshna. So as the title suggests, as the title makes us aware of 2 points on a map, we are talking here about domesticity and academics or academia, So we assume, when we talk about these 2 categories, we assume that these are 2 points on a map and they kind of entail a journey between the same. In a sense, this is true, because think of a young woman who has set up home, who has got married, who has set up home, has a family, a young family. She is mired in domesticity, and then the next logical step for her, if she has any scrap of ambition in her, is to look for a job, is to equip herself professionally. So it's a kind of a linear thing in one sense. But for me, these 2 categories were never absolute or mutually exclusive, domesticity and academics. Because I remember that in the early days of my domesticity, I was actually actively involved in academics. I sat for my MA examination after my marriage. I enrolled my PhD in Jadavpur University under Indranidhi, Dr. Indrani Haldar, naturally after that. Then once you are in, when you are pursuing a PhD, a dissertation, you're doing a dissertation, you have to avail certain opportunities. And I remember I obtained 2 grants, 2 teacher research grants from what was then known as the American Studies Research Center in Hyderabad. So I left my infant daughter and I went on 2 consecutive years to do my, basic research in the area. Part of it was on American literature. Then again, I received a junior research fellowship from the UGC. Why I'm saying all these things is that academics was always there, so these were deeply intertwined. While they are linear trajectories, domesticity and academics, they are at the same time deeply interlinked. They are overlapping, contiguous, simultaneous movements, And thank you. And when we talk about domesticity, we also think that it's a kind of a gendered space within the home, the cozy interiors of a house, and you think of the living space, the dining space, the living area, the living room, the kitchen particularly, because of its associations with food. And food as a source of sustenance, has to do a lot with domesticity. But domesticity is not only a floor plan, it also has to do with the negotiation of a tricky tightrope of familial relationships. So these were also things which I had been through, like any person in the same situation would have done, and caring for an infant, attending to old parents, looking after the family. So these were all par for the course, So domesticity is something that is there. And it's not as though once you get a job or once you're professionally qualified and established, it leaves you. It's not like that. So it's I would say that domesticity is a constant. It's a context. It's a concept. I would say it's a covert collaborator in all our outwardly inclined projects, because the home is that private space from where we operate in the world. So I cannot discern any sharp breaks between the two worlds, you know. So, and in fact, in my case, once I got a job, you know, I started off with a lectureship at St. Paul's Cathedral Mission College. I was deliriously happy there, and you know, like basically because of the sense of identity, you know, I felt that I was quote unquote doing something, as in holding down a regular job, you know. But that didn't mean that domesticity took a back seat, because if anything, I threw myself into it with greater zeal, because I had the financial wherewithal. You know, I was a liberated modern woman with economic autonomy. So I remember I still experimented with recipes. I still baked and decorated cakes on birthdays, anniversaries, Christmas. I remember making those forays to Goriahat market and other markets, you know, to buy the occasional house plant, you know, to do up the home so that to make it a more livable space. So these things are there. They are contiguous movements. And if there is any one image that I would use to demonstrate the convergence of the two worlds, domesticity on the one hand and academia on the other, I would use most certainly the image of the dining table. Because the dining table was that item of furniture around which the family gathered at meal times, around which we entertained our guests, our friends, our colleagues, you know, on weekends. This was a kind of an extended kitchen counter where I chopped vegetables and I shaped the cutlets and I decorated the cakes and, you know, all the rest of it. But come night, and it transformed into a study table. And I would use it for my research work and, you know, the seminar presentations and everything. So that dining table to me becomes a very potent symbol of the two worlds and how they come together, how they remain intrinsically separate and yet they come together in interesting configurations. Also, one other image I would like to point out, sometimes when I would go through my research papers, you know, I would find that my daughter's play school papers would be mingled with my papers, you know, and her childish handwriting would be all over the place. So these are certain symbols of the convergence of the two worlds that a woman typically and traditionally has to, face in the kind of journey that we embark upon. But I would like, as Sudeshna has asked me, I would like to add a third element, introduce a third element into this dualistic dynamics of domesticity and academics. And this is one of creativity. Ever since my childhood, I had this very glorified idea of, you know, wanting to become quote unquote a writer. That is what I wanted to do. Somehow I drifted into the academia, I don't know how. And I started writing when I was in my +2 and in classes 11 and 12. And I got some of these pieces published while I was in college, in St. Xavier's College. And St. Xavier's was a nursery for, you know, literary and other talents. And I remember I used to contribute to Youth Times and what was known as the Telegraph Color magazine. Subsequently, it was christened Graffiti, and it has been rechristened something else, I don't know exactly what. But Pritish Nandi used to be the poetry editor of Youth Times. Anil Grover was the Calcutta correspondent for Femina, and he helped me a lot. I had submitted some material to him, and he told me how exactly to submit material. And I don't remember, it was probably Jayant Mahapatra who was the poetry editor for the Telegraph magazine, and he had selected a few of my poems on a couple of occasions. So those were heady days, you know. I was kind of fulfilling my ambition of becoming the quote-unquote writer part of it. But unfortunately, I don't know how or when I drifted away from my first love. How this happened, I don't exactly know. And I found that I was getting increasingly drawn into the world of academic writing, teaching, correcting, evaluating those endless answer scripts, you know, and of course the domestic world was always there. And it was, I think, in 2013 that I, excuse me, I came up with my first literary attempt. This book was called The Journey Eternal. It was called, excuse me, thank you so much. Thank you, Sudeshna. So this book was called The Journey Eternal, and it was brought out by Salesian College, Siliguri, Salesian College Publications, and it was part of their 75th anniversary celebration. Now, this was a book of poetic plays on biblical themes. And the genesis of this book was interesting because it grew out of my experiences in the academia. Here we were discussing the academia and domesticity, and now I'm talking about the academia and how it helped me to come up with this book. How exactly? Every year I was tasked, the principal would tell me that, Ajanta, you write a play for the nativity program. So every year I would find myself, writing. It had to be something new, and I would rack my brains and come up with a new idea, try to at least. And so after some years I found that I had a store of these plays with me, poetic plays, which the students would act. And we would train them and supervise them to act out these plays every year for Christmas. And this is how this book came into being. So I added a few more plays, and this gave me the confidence that yes, I can do imaginative writing. And my next attempt, my next book was The Elixir Maker and Other Stories in 2019. Then I came up with 3 poetry books, one after the other, books of poems. One was published by Setu, 2023, January, if I remember correctly. It was called From the Singing Bowl of the Soul, 50 Poems. And then we have Hawakal's Beached Driftwood, the same year, 2023. And I'm so grateful to Hawakal for having brought out this book, which has 75 poems, and all the poems are very close to my heart. Some of them have been published earlier in various journals and magazines, but they have not, for the first time, they have been brought together in the form of a book. And finally, my last publication was a volume of eco-critical poetry called Earth Elegies, which was in 2024. So, and one more point I would like to mention here, Sudeshna, and that is, I was talking about the convergence between different worlds, and if academia had contributed to the genesis of a particular volume of poetic plays, I would say that I derive my themes, a great many of my themes, from the domestic world. The image of sputtering cumin seeds on the hot griddle, or the image of sharbat, cakes, or spices, or I have a short story called Flat Hunting, I have another short story called The Recipe Book. And in that story, the recipes they constitute a device, a narrative device through which the story is told. I have another story called The Currency Jar, and it was published in the Statesman. And there I use the image of a cake which eventually gets burnt and blackened, like the dreams of the old Goan couple who are the protagonists of the story. So I depend heavily on the domestic life and its associations for my imagery when it comes to my poetry or my short stories. Sudeshna. Yes, sure.
I can't help but ask, you just mentioned an image of the dining table. So when we look at a dining table, at a domestic household, so what comes to our mind is very organized and very lit up space, well lit up space. But when you are writing, especially poetry, you have to refine your thoughts, and at the same time you are dealing with your spontaneous overflow of powerful emotions. How do you, these contrasting things, these overlapping things, how do you deal with that?
Somudranil, that's a difficult question. Actually, I had used the dining table with regard to the world of domesticity and academics. How I would carry out my studies on the same table on which I worked for the home. And actually, as it happens, I do most of my writing on my phone. Whether it is short story, whether it is a poem, and I can do it on the go. Say when I'm journeying from home to college or back again to home, I just whip out my phone and capture the line which comes to me. I find it extremely handy. So I have been doing all my writing since the past 5 years, 6, 7 years on the phone, on Google Docs. And the little that I have been doing on the dining table, yes, you are right. Then that calls for a lot of schooling of one's emotions, and I have to be grounded and I have to be very disciplined. As Shanjukta was saying, that is something that she can't be. So you have to gather your wits and your, and be there for that period of time. Because I know then after that I will have to close my laptop and attend to something else. So it calls for a judicious distribution of time, of attention, of inclination, of all the resources that you have at hand. I think you are very right, because it's difficult to but then most of us, in Bengali households, the bed, not even the dining table, is the bed where one does one's writing, lolling against bolsters and pillows and so on, right? So it's interesting how these domestic spaces double up, and gives us optimal opportunities so that we can use it in different ways.
Yeah, Ajanta saved me with that last bit of what she said. I was getting a huge inferiority complex here. Somudranil and Ajanta both saying that the dining table has to be, is this organized and clean place to write? And I was thinking that how messy my own tables are with lots of nicks and knacks. If I had to sit and write there, first half an hour would go into cleaning it, but when Ajanta finally said that no, it's the bed where we finally go to, I was like, okay, that is something that I could identify with. Those were very interesting observations, and one thing that I also felt when I was reading through this book is how the lived experiences of domesticity have contributed to some extremely evocative creative works. One of my absolute favorites from this collection is the poem Rice, and the images that came into the poet's mind from that domestic chore of preparing rice for the family. I would just like to share a few lines with the audience. They'll understand what I'm speaking about, for those of you who have not yet managed to go through the book. The white steamed rice bloom like water lilies on the silver lake of her steel plate. Fragrant with the promise of satiation, shadows rippling in its depths, reminding her of roots shivering in paddy fields where the standing water of life's stilled flow nurtured the crops, haunting her with the enchanting songs of harvest when sons return home to lend that extra hand. The husking in showers of gold, the chaff flies like sunshine in the face of looming clouds. But that was long ago, before the fields became fallow and green turned yellow. Vapor rises from her plate like haze drifting around the moon or mist off a lagoon. She swallows a morsel of the magic grains. They caress her tongue with silken satiety, settling into the folds of her hunger, sealing the yearning within her with the spreading warmth of fulfillment like molten wax in the cracks of rough-hewn wood. This, I think, is the perfect example of how the food for the belly becomes the food for the soul. This is the magic of creativity. This is the magic of words, of images. And as Ajanta Di's poem itself says, that somewhere in us a sonnet lies buried, a sonnet that is trying to come out from all of us. And the themes that keep coming here in this poem. Next, I would like to hear about that from the poet. The three major thematic clusters that I felt were, one, the exploration of the self, and as she very rightly pointed out, the navigation of the different human relationships which we enter into through matrimony, or before that, how the work-life balance changes. So that exploration. The next, of course, is the social and political realities which we get from the poems like the migrant workers or After the Riot, and the creative exploration, like somewhere a sonnet lies buried in all of us and all of that. These are basically the three major thematic clusters that I felt when I was reading through this book. Would you like to elaborate on the three?
You're very right, Sudeshna. I would say that you have identified the clusters quite correctly. And there are those poems, which are aesthetic allegories or meta poems, poems which tell about their own genesis. As for example, Somewhere a Sonnet Lies Buried, or I have another poem called Birth of an Author, or the poem Marooned, where the speaker is trying out different voices and styles and wants to be rescued and put into creative rehabilitation from that state of being marooned and so on. So there are these poems which connect imaginatively with the title. Then we have a second group which has to do with social consciousness, which have a social message. As for example, you have rightly pointed out the poem called The Migrants. And there's also another poem such as Visibly Invisible, which deals with the poor workman, who is hanging from his harness as he's painting the top floors of a high-rise, and so on. Now, I have a few poems on the theme of ecology also. This Map is Old, and Ruin, and I can't remember the names, but a couple of other poems which connect with the theme, the eco-critical theme. And Kiriti, in fact, pointed out to me, he said that, Ajanta Di, there's a lot of pain in your poetry. So then I took a deeper look at the volume, and I found, yes, indeed. And I have a number of poems which deal with intense emotional pain, anguish, suffering. The poem Fired Clay, where the speaker says that she's put in a furnace and she is made into refined china, but people admire the china, but people do not see the processes of suffering that she has been exposed to, the high heat and so on. So Fired Clay, Eyes, and again a few other poems. And then I would say that there are a few poems which have feminist echoes. The poem Rebirth for instance, or the poem, I forget the title, there's a poem called My Grandmother's Hands, and other poems, you know, which have to do with the willpower of the girl child as she wants to survive and make good in this life. A few poems which would fit the gerontological bracket. Poems about old age, you know, origami of outfits and so on. And one last cluster, I would say, which had to do with death. You know, there's a poem called Disposal. There's a poem called Ritual of Survival, and another poem also which has to do with it, yet another group which has to do with human relationships, as for example the poem Hibernation. So, you know, if you want to calibrate it further, Sudeshna has already identified 3 clusters, then you can, you know, think of these various sub-themes which come to the fore. Thank you.
Thank you, Ajanta. Those were wonderful insights. I think we have covered the major themes of this book. The rest is for, of course, the individual readers to discover. I would like to conclude the session, if I'm given the permission, Ajanta, with one poem of hers, which I feel is a kind of amalgamation of all the themes that we are talking about. It talks about an individual mother's journey, but through that it is dealing with the social realities of women, and it is a political statement. It is about food and domesticity. So all of the themes, I think, come together perfectly in this poem. So I'll end with this, this short one for your ears. The mother didn't eat or ate sparingly when the 4th child was in her womb, thinking probably of starving this new creature forming somewhere within her. She didn't care. But the child, unborn as yet, had other plans and refused to comply, to just wilt and die. A toehold here, a foothold there, a clawing on stony outcrops of the barest accommodation, drawing choking lungfuls of air from a freezing atmosphere, pushing up like a determined stalk through unyielding soil in scrubby vegetation, clutching at the hint of a smile around pursed lips as an incentive to go that extra mile, breaking a fall down steep rock faces, heart thudding, pulse racing, mind a blur of rock and air, smell of a world coming apart in the belly, a knot of fear, snatching the sun from behind the clouds for that ever so brief an hour, smearing its golden butter on wan slices of everyday matter, wringing life like a wet rag to extract its last drop. She managed to survive, live, and even thrive. Thank you.